Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shabbat. We are up to Perek Zayin, Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev, Neriyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. This Mishnah lists the 39 main categories of melacha, of forbidden work that are prohibited on Shabbat. The Torah, we know, warns against working on Shabbat immediately before it describes the building of the Mishkan in Sefer Shemot, chapter 35, Pasuk 4. It therefore teaches that the types of work prohibited on Shabbat are those that were necessary for the construction of the Mishkan, like we see in the Gemara, Masechet Shabbat, page 49b, with Rashi. The main types of labor that were performed then, 39 in total, are known as avot melachot, primary labors, as the Gemara calls them in Masechet Baba Kama, page 2a. They represent general categories of labor, each of which includes a number of related melachot known as toladot, derivative labors. The toladot are biblically forbidden and carry the same penalties as the avot. The Mishnah begins, Avot melachot 40 chaser echat. The number of avot melachot is 40 minus 1, which is 39. Now the Mefarshim explain, it seems unnecessary for the Mishnah to state the total number of the avot melachot when we could find this out for ourselves simply by counting them, because it's going to list each one. The Gemara explains that the Mishnah specified the number to teach that if a person did every melacha possible, including all the toladot, he is required to bring no more than 39 chatat offerings, because one who performs an av together with its toladot is liable to bring just one offering. And we explained in the previous Mishnayot. Now the Tosfot Yom Tov explains the expression 40 minus 1 is borrowed from the Mishnah in Makot, chapter 3, Mishnah 10, where it is used to reflect the fact that the Torah states 40 lashes in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 25, Pasuk 3, when in fact it means 39. So it's copying that same type of language. Now, the Mishnah is going to divide the melachot in different steps. The first 11 melachot are steps in the process of making bread. Now, the Mefarshim explain, in the process of making dyes to color the Mishkan's curtains and coverings, it was necessary to use certain ingredients that were made from herbs, as the Rambam explains if you see in the Rambam, the Chotzitzit, chapter 2, Halakha 2. The first 11 melachot were performed in the growing, preparation, and cooking of these herbs and dyes. Our Mishnah, however, lists them in the context of making bread, as is evident from the 11th melacha, which is baking, which refers to bread, as opposed to cooking, which is dyes. The Tana chose to describe the steps in making bread because that process is more common than making dyes. So we begin. Number 1, hazorea, planting, which the Mefarshim explain, although the av melacha is called zorea, which refers to sowing seeds in the ground, it includes planting saplings as well, since there is no real difference between sowing and planting. The concept of this melacha is any activity that causes vegetation to sprout or grow. Therefore, its toladot includes watering plants and trees, as the Rambam writes in Chot Shabbat, chapter 8, Halakha 2. Next, we have hachoresh, plowing, which the Mefarshim explain. The av melacha includes making a furrow in the ground and digging a hole in which to sow or plant. In general, the melacha compromises any act of improving the ground to make it more suitable for planting. Among its toladot are smoothing bumps in the ground, filling holes, and plucking weeds. Now, since plowing prepares the ground for planting, it should be mentioned first. However, the Mishnah lists it after planting to teach that where the earth is hard and one must plow it a second time to cover the seeds that were sown, one is liable for the second plowing as well. Number 3, akotzer, reaping, which is detaching any growing plant from its source, such as reaping stalks of wheat or plucking fruit from a tree. They all fall into the category of reaping. Number 4, hamamel, gathering. The harvested crop is gathered into small bundles in the field, which are later gathered into one large bundle. Both acts are avot of this melacha. Sticking dates together to make a cake of dates and threading figs together on a string are toladot of this melacha. Number 5, hadash, threshing. This is detaching the kernels of grain from their husks. Its toladot include milking animals and squeezing the liquid from grapes and olives. Number 6, hazoreh, winnowing. After the kernels are detached from their husks, the mixture is tossed into the air with a pitchfork. The wind blows away the chaff, which is the husks, stems, and leaves, leaving the heavier kernels. This melacha is the first of 3 in which one removes unwanted items that are mixed together with wanted items. Number 7, haborer, selecting. After winnowing, the next step in the bread making process is picking out and removing any pebbles or stones that are mixed among the kernels of grain. In general, this melacha involves removing by hand or utensil unwanted matter from that which is wanted. Utensil refers to a strainer in this case. Removing unwanted matter from that which is wanted. Number 8, atochen, grinding. This av includes grinding kernels of grain into flour and pounding spices into powder, right? So grinding kernels of grain into flour, pounding spices into powder. The broad definition of the melacha is breaking down a large item into many much smaller ones. Therefore, chopping vegetables into very small pieces is forbidden as a tolada, as the Rambam says in his Erchot Shabbat, chapter 7, halacha 5, and chapter 8, halacha 15. Number 9, hamraked, sifting. After the kernels of grain have been ground into flour, the flour is placed in a sieve and shaken. The fine flour falls through the holes in the sieve, leaving on top the relatively coarse granules of bran. Now, although winnowing, selecting, and sifting, which was 6, 7, and 9, they all have one purpose, to remove the unwanted matter from a mixture, the Mishnah counts them as 3 separate avot because they are performed in 3 separate stages. First, one winnows the chaff from the kernels, then one separates the pebbles from the kernels, and then after the kernels have been ground into flour, one sifts the flour to purify it. Number 10, we have halash, kneading, which in the bread making process, water is poured onto flour and they are mixed to form a dough. So the general melacha entails forming a mixture of liquid and small solid pieces in which the liquid makes the solid pieces stick to each other. And the last melacha of baking, we have va'ofeh and baking. The last melacha making the bread is ha'ofeh, baking. This av includes cooking or baking an item until it is edible, as with bread, or usable, as with dyes. The melacha is defined as using fire to soften a hard item or harden a soft one. Among its toladot are melting wax or metal and heating clay to make earthenware, as the Rambam says in Chot Shabbat, chapter 9, halacha 6. The next 13 melachot are stages in the process of making cloth. Now, the following 13 melachot were performed to produce cloth for the Mishkan. Hagozez et atzemer, shearing wool, which is cutting wool or hair from a live or dead animal, or even from hide that was already removed from an animal. They are all forms of the av of shearing. Number 13, hamlabeno, washing it, which cleaning wool or any similar substance in water. 14, vahamnat pitzot, disentangling it, which the jumbled fibers of wool are combed or beaten with a stick to disentangle them and prepare them for spinning. 15, atzovot, dyeing it. After the fibers of wool are washed and combed, but before they are spun into thread, they are colored through being soaked in dye. Number 16, vatoves, spinning thread, meaning twisting fibers together to make threads. Number 17, vamesech, warping, which is the first step of the weaving process, is to extend a number of threads across a loom or other weaving device. These are called the warp thread sheti. Setting up the warp threads in preparation for weaving is the melacha of warping. I recommend for these next few melachot, they're hard to describe because we're not used to making cloth and we're not used to the equipment, but to look in the Art School Elucidated in the various diagrams, diagram A, B, C, D, E, and F, to help us understand these melachot. So we said 17, amesech, warping. Number 18, aoseh shne batei nirin, setting 2 heddles. Which the Mefarshim explain. The weaving process is made easier by using a loom or other device that can raise every alternate warp thread at the same time. The standard method of raising alternate threads together is to use heddles. A heddle is a string or rod that has a ring in the center. There are several different types of looms, each with a different arrangement of heddles. A common type of loom has a large roller at each of its two ends. Because between these rollers are two frames, one in the front of the other, that are called harnesses. The heddles extend from the top to the bottom of each harness. Right, and the Mefarshim explained the process. I'm going to go on with the Mishnah just because you have to see it inside with the diagrams to help it understand it better. So number 19, so we said 18, setting two heddles. Number 19, weaving two threads, which refers to inserting the weft thread twice through the warp thread. So for example, right to left and then left to right. Number 20, removing two threads, which refers to removing two threads of the weft or the warp from the finished cloth in order to improve it. So if, for example, the threads are packed too densely. Number 21, kosher, tying a knot. And 22 is hametir, untying a knot. Now, fishing nets were used to trap the chilazon, a small aquatic creature whose secretion is tchelet, the special blue dye used for the curtains and one of the coverings of the Mishkan. These nets were made of ropes tied together with knots. Sometimes it was necessary to untie ropes from one net so they could be added to another net. So those are two melachot. 23, hatofer shtet tfirot, sewing two stitches. Now a minimum of two passes of the needle, one in and one out, are required for one to be liable for sewing. This in and out motion actually result in only one stitch, but shtet tfirot is translated as two stitches because there's no equivalent word in modern English for a single pass of the needle. So we call shtet tfirot. Now one who sews exactly two stitches is not liable unless he ties the ends together, because otherwise they will not hold. In that case, he's liable for two melachot, sewing and tying, because he tied it at the end. Number 24, hakoreh al menat litfor shtet tfirot, and tearing in order to sew two stitches. So the Rav explains, when a small hole was found in the curtains of the Mishkan, they would make the hole bigger by tearing the fabric next to it. A tailor could then repair the hole neatly without making creases in the cloth. The next 7 melachot pertain to the preparation of animal skins, because the Mefarshim explain one of the coverings of the Mishkan was made from the hides of the tachash, an animal that existed only at that time. The following melachot were performed in the preparation of these hides. Number 25, atzad tzvi, trapping a deer, meaning catching an animal directly or trapping it in an enclosed area where it can easily be caught. The Mishnah mentions a deer because it's the most common example of a hunted animal. Number 26, ashochato, slaughtering it. Any manner of taking the life of an animal is included in the category of slaughtering it. Va'mafshito, number 27, skinning it. After slaughtering the deer, its hide is removed to be made into leather or parchment. Number 28, anmolcho, salting its hide. So for a hide to be usable as leather or parchment, it must be dried and then softened. This is the process of tanning. In those times, tanning involves salting the hide and then soaking it in various substances. Now, the Gemara finds difficulty with the separate listing of salting and tanning, because salting is just the beginning of the tanning process. So it concludes that both are avot of one melacha. The Gemara therefore removes one of them from the Mishnah and replaces it with number 29. Okay, well, in our Mishnah we have 29, hamabed et orot, tanning its hide, but the Gemara replaces it with hamsartet, scoring, which the Rav says before cutting leather, one scores lines in it where the cuts will be made so that the cuts will be smooth and straight. But our Mishnah says, number 29, hamabed et orot, tanning its hide. Number 30, amuchako, smoothing the hide, which is scraping the hair off the hide to produce smooth parchment or leather. And number 31, hamchatecho, cutting the hide, which refers to trimming and cutting the hide into a specific size for such items as straps or shoes. Now the final 8 melachot, hakotev shte otiyot, writing 2 letters. Now writing at least 2 letters is the av melacha of writing. They wrote a letter on each beam of the Mishkan's wall so that when they reassembled the Mishkan, they could pair up every 2 beams that were meant to be next to each other. Number 33, erasing in order to write 2 letters. Now, if they made a mistake in writing the letters on the beam of the Mishkan, they would erase them to make room for the correct letters. So the Av is erasing 2 letters, or even 1 large letter, in order to write 2 letters in their place, as the Gemara says on page 75b in Masechet Shabbat. Number 34, aboneh, building, which Mefarshim explain, making, repairing, or improving even a small part of a structure, is the Av Melacha of building. Number 35, vasoter, demolishing, which means demolishing for the sake of building. So for example, knocking down a wall to build a doorway. Number 36, hamchabe, extinguishing a fire. Now, and number 37, lighting a fire. And the Mefarshim explain, when the Mishkan was being built, they kindled and extinguished the fire under the pot in which the dyes were cooked. Now, some say that the melacha of extinguishing is derived from the practice in the Mishkan of lighting wicks and then extinguishing them. This act of extinguishing served the positive, constructive purpose of turning the tip of the wick into charcoal, which made it easier to light the wick in the future. But again, we have 36 and 37, hamchabe, extinguishing a fire, and hamavil, lighting a fire. Number 38, hamakebe patish, striking the final blow, literally. The words mean one who strikes with a hammer, but the Mefarshim explain when a craftsman makes something out of metal, he puts the metal on an anvil, an iron block, and beats it into the shape that he wants. After every few blows, he bangs his hammer directly onto the anvil in order to flatten any jagged edges that may have formed on the hammerhead. The melacha striking the final blow refers to the last blow of the hammer, which is delivered after the metal object is completed. With this blow, he smooths out the hammer, making it ready for the next job. This is the very last step in the process of making the metal object. The essence of this melacha is the final touch made at the completion of a process or the formation of an object. And finally, number 39, hamotzi mereshut dereshut, transferring objects from one domain to another, which this melacha involves moving an object from a public domain to a private domain, or a private domain to a public domain, or at least 4 amot, 6 to 8 feet in a public domain. The Mishnah concludes, Hare elu avot melachot 40 chaser achat. These are the avot melachot 40 minus 1. Now the Mishnah repeats the count. We started out saying 40 minus 1, but the Mishnah repeats it. The Mishnah repeats it again to emphasize that there are only 39 avot melachot and not more. In contrast to the Tana Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that there are 2 more avot melachot, both of which are stages in the weaving process. The Mishnah therefore repeats, these are the avot melachot 49 minus 1 to teach that the Rabbi Yehuda's 2 additional melachot are not avot, but merely toladot of the weaving melachot already mentioned, as the Tosfot Yom Tov tells us. That is the Rabotai Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now continues. After listing all the 39 melachot, the Mishnah discusses many of them individually. Continuing from the end of the list, it first deals with the melacha of transferring. As a rule, a person is not liable for transferring unless the item that he carried has significance. This Mishnah defines what is deemed significant in this context. Vod klal acher amru, the rabbi stated another rule about Shabbat. Kol kasher la'atzniya o matznin kamo, anything that is fit for people to store and is in a quantity that people store is considered significant. V'otzio b'Shabbat chayav alav chatat. And thus, if one carried it outside on Shabbat, one would be liable to bring a chatat for it. Votzio b'Shabbat chayav alav chatat. Right? If you carried it out on Shabbat, one would be liable to bring a chatat for it. The Mishnah teaches here that one is not liable for transferring a substance or material unless it meets 2 conditions. Number 1, it is one that people do not discard but store for future use. And number 2, the amount that was carried is large enough for people to regard as worth keeping. Now, the amount deemed important varies from one item to another, like we're going to see in the following Mishnayot. The converse of this rule is v'chol she'eno kasher la'atzniya ven matznin kamo, any substance or material that is not fit for people to store or is not in a quantity that people store is not significant. V'otzio b'Shabbat eno chayav elo matznio. And so, if one carried it outside on Shabbat, one would not be liable unless he is a person who in fact views it as significant and stores it. Now, if a person has a particular need or like for a certain substance and stored a small quantity of it, even though most people would not store it at all or they would store it only in large quantity, he would be liable for transferring it because it's important to him. Other people, however, would not be liable for transferring since in their eyes, it has no significance. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Again, we went through it a little quickly. I recommend if somebody wants to go through all 39 melachot, to open up the article elucidated, read the notes, look at the diagrams, get a better idea of the various melachot. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen.